My name is Margaret Fuller, and I was born on March 22nd, 1935,
Where were you born?
Palo Alto, California.
So you were born in California and you grew up in California, and then when did you move to Idaho?
1957. My husband, Wayne, graduated from law school that year at Stanford.
Okay.
And we had 3 orchards cut down between our house and the foothills kind of behind Stanford and campus that one year, and we could kind of see the print of what was going to happen there. And so Wayne went looking for jobs in the Pacific Northwest, and he ended up finding one in Boise. And so we moved to Boise in June of 1957, and we lived in an apartment right by the depot. The trains went right by our house.
I bet that was noisy.
It was. And our little boy he would get up in his crib and rock back and forth, and we didn't know if it was because he was afraid of the trains or if he was trying to be a train.
So was your first son born in Idaho, or was he
In
born
California.
in California? Okay. So you moved here with your young son and your husband.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you ever went to Stanley or to the Sawtooth?
Yes, very vividly. My husband was studying for the bar, and he was also working for a firm in Boise that was called Fredericks and Roberts. And he had taken me up over Galena Summit on our honeymoon when we went to Buell to visit his parents. And we, drove up, and he wanted to show me the Sawtooth, so we went over Galena, and it was all smoky from a forest fire, and I could only see wooded hills. And so I had to tell him, well, it was a nice view. And then he said, well, I think we should go down to Alturas Lake because you might be able to see more mountains there. So we went down to Alturas Lake, drove to the inlet beach, walked on the beach, couldn't see anything. It was still just wooded hills. And so then I happened to be downtown Boise shopping, and I went into the ID, and there were all these pictures of great huge mountains, so beautiful, on the wall. And I thought, what is that? I asked the clerk. Oh, that's the Sawtooth. And I couldn't believe it because all I'd seen was these wooded hills.
That's right there.
So anyway, I persuaded Wayne that maybe we could take a weekend and go to the Sawtooth, and he said that would be fine, because when he was a Boy Scout growing up in Buell, he had gone up and gone to the Boulders and the Smokies, and actually they camped one year right at the inlet campground at Altura. So anyway, I thought, well, we can't go very far because we don't have money for gasoline. So we drove to Idaho City, and then we drove to Loman, and the road was all, of course, not paved, any of it.
Yeah.
And then to get to Stanley, you had to drive up through Bear Valley, and that's what we did.
Oh, wow.
And we camped in Bear Valley the first night.
Okay.
And then we drove on and eventually got to Redfish at noon the next day. And there was plenty of campsites in those days. And we went to the Point Campground and camped at a campground near site there.
Yeah.
And then Wayne was talking to some of the neighboring campers, and they said, oh, well, if you want to go to Bench Lake, that's a short hike, and you can just go from here. You don't have to go back to the lodge and take the real trail, and you can just walk uphill, and you'll catch the trail in a little bit. So, of course, we wanted to do that, and I had gotten a little pack frame at the department store in Caldwell, or maybe in Boise, anyway. And we tied Doug onto the pack frame with old belts of Wayne's, and we set off to go to the Bench Lakes.
Perfect.
And of course, I kept sliding down, and we had to stop and redo the thing several times. They had not invented baby backpacks then.
Yeah.
And so we did eventually get to Bench Lakes.
You bushwhacked up the hill.
Yeah, I mean, we went up the hill and then finally got to the real trail and walked along it for a while and then turned off and went up. But there wasn't a zigzag trail like there is today. It was just a little kind of path that went up this creek. But we did get there, and then Wayne fished and caught a little fish that he threw back.
Nice.
And I kept track of Doug and put him between two big logs, and so he couldn't escape, but he wanted to escape.
He wanted to explore.
Yes, he he tried to go out, and he finally managed to get out of the enclosure and said, "I go away." Anyway, that was my first hike in the Sawtooth.
Yeah, wow. So Bench Lakes. Do you remember if you saw were there other people hiking up at Bench Lakes that day?
I don't remember seeing anybody, but you know, I could have seen some people and just forgotten it. There is,
Well, okay, so that was your first
yeah,
trip to the Sawtooths, and you actually got to see the big mountains.
yeah,
And then, did you fall in love? Did you want to keep going back?
of course.
Yeah.
Yes, I was trying to think what year it was. It was probably in 1961, I think. We saw an article, possibly it was in the Statesman or maybe it was in the Navacolo paper, I'm not sure, about that the Forest Service was leasing lots for summer cabins up in the Sawtooth Valley. And they said, the article said, $40 a year. And so we thought, boy, we could afford that, and that would be nice. We should go up there and get a lot.
Yeah.
And by then we had another child, Leslie, who was about 3 years younger than Doug. And so, and anyway, we went up on Labor Day weekend to pick out a lot, and we took Leslie with us, but Doug had just had his tonsils out, so we had to stay with his grandma in Buell while we went up there. And so we went up and we picked a lot and applied for it, and then you know you have to fill out all this paperwork and stuff.
Yeah. Wow. So where was the lot?
Oh, it is between Alturas and Pettit Lakes.
So for $40 a year, you got to lease the land, and then.
Okay, then in 1963, I think, my husband and a guy who owed him some money for illegal work and knew how to build things anyway, they went up and built the foundations of a cabin. I mean, they had to get it all approved by the Forest Service first, of course. And all that they got done that year was to do what they call footings, where you pour concrete underneath and then they put cinder blocks. So there was 2 cinder blocks there, and we have a good picture of our 2 kids helping put rocks on the top and boards on the top of the cinder blocks to keep it for the winter. And then our youngest, Neil, was in a playpen, and he's observing the operation there. And so 5 years later, Wayne and Doug, who was then about 12, and a carpenter he hired from Stanley named J.G. Nicholson, who at that time was the mayor.
Okay.
Anyway, J.G. and Wayne and Doug built the shell of the cabin.
Wow.
And they got the lumber from Wayne's brother's lumber yard in Buell. It used to be, his father had started it right after World War II. It was called Fuller Farm and Home Supply.
Okay.
And it's gone now. There's nothing there but some cement on the ground.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so then over many years, we finished the cabin. And finally, in I think 2010, we hired a different carpenter. I think JG, I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he had passed away by then. But anyway, a different carpenter to do all the work that we had done, like to put the paneling on the ceiling of the area that we had left open to the loft, because it's got a loft that goes around and has little bedrooms for the kids and half walls that go up.
Yeah.
And then there's this open area that goes clear up to the ceiling. Well, anyway, this guy did that and made new flooring. I mean, there were just a number of things that he did to get it pretty much all finished. And he ordered some cabinets, real cabinets, instead of this. I mean, we had, for a long time, we had something we called my niece Jenny called it the unrefrigerator, because there was an old refrigerator that we didn't use anymore, and we kept things in it. And so anyway, we still have to work on the cabin from time to time to do different things. And we had a person build a new deck when the Forest Service thought our old deck was kind of falling down, which it was.
Yeah.
And now we have it so that we can take down the boards for the deck. You know, it's got a fence. You're supposed to have that. And we can take it down in the winter so it doesn't get squished by the snow.
Yeah. So when they first built it in the 60s, did you guys start going up like for the summer?
We didn't go up for the summer, but we would go up, you know, and hike, and Wayne would take some time and we'd go. And then I would also try to stay a week longer if he let me with the kids.
Yeah.
And I can remember going up in 1968 was the year that we built the cabin, or Wayne and Doug and Nicholson did. But I mean, it was like staying in a house under construction, but we did that.
Yeah.
I mean, there were just studs inside, no doors, no walls, just, you know, and the unrefrigerator. Being a refrigerator in those days.
Yeah.
And we plugged in extension cords to the power pole outside. And when they were building the cabin is when the Salmon River REA was building their lines to that area. There had never been electricity before, but it was lucky that it was that year. And when they were building the cabin, there was a guy there that had a backhoe, I guess, and Wayne hired him to build a little driveway up behind the cabin, and also, what else did he do? Oh, scrape off the land so that we could not have to have a big drop off to work with. It was just going to be flat, which is much easier to build a cabin.
Yeah.
So anyway, they got the power in there then.
And so, at that time, did you have 5 kids?
Yes, by the time the cabin was actually built, we had the 5 kids.
Okay. And so you would take the kids hiking, right? That's
Yeah, okay, then that first year in '69, Wayne at that time, he was very active in the Democratic Party, which of course is not a good thing if you live in Idaho. But he was. He had to go to, I think, Pocatello or Idaho Falls for something to do with the Democrats. And maybe he had a case over there, I don't know, because he's practicing law in Tomball by then. Anyway, now what? I took the kids up to the cabin, even though Wayne said, you shouldn't do that. But I did it anyway, and I didn't tell him. And of course, we didn't have any telephone or anything, and you don't have cell phones in these days, so it was pretty dangerous, but I did it anyway.
Yeah.
And we went up and stayed, and then we went to see the ranger, whose name was Ralph Cisco, and he was the Sawtooth Valley district ranger. You know, now it's just a work center. Okay, but that's the ranger station then.
Okay.
So we go to his office and I ask him, well, where should I take these kids hiking? Where are some short hikes? Okay, so Mr. Cisco said, well, you could go to Sawtooth Lake, it's only 4 miles, and it has a good road in there. Or you can go to 4th of July Lake, and it's only 1 mile. And I asked, well, what about the road being there? And he said, what kind of car do you have? And I said, a GMC Travel, or what, I'm not sure if it was a GMC, but anyway. And he said, well, it has a high wheelbase, doesn't it? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you can make it all right. But he really didn't tell me about the road, what I really needed to know. So I started out with the kids in the car and our packed lunches, and the first thing we did in about a mile or two was to see this great big puddle. It was probably as long as this room. And I thought, can we even drive through it? So I sent Doug out, and he took a stick and measured how deep it was, and he brought it back. And he said, well, Mom, it's only 6 deep, I think 6 inches. I think we can get through it. So I drove through it. But then the road got worse and worse, of course. I mean, it was all covered with great big rocks.
Yeah.
But I just kept going. And we finally got to this meadow where the next thing the road did was go through a little creek. I thought, well, this is the end of the road. And I looked off to the right, and there was another road going off. And I thought, well, our Forest Service map shows that the trail goes off to the right. So it's at the end of the road. So this must be the end of the road. So we get out and start out up this road, which of course is the road that goes up towards Phyllis Lake.
Okay, yeah.
And so we walked, and presently, of course, this was the middle of June or late June, and so there was snow. And the kids started having a snowball fight. But we kept going, and finally we got to a place where, I mean, the snow was really deep, and you couldn't really tell which way to go. And I thought, and my Neil, who was then 7, it said, why did they put the lake so far? And so I stopped and we had lunch. And I said, we have to turn around because we really don't know if this is the right way.
Yeah.
And it's too snowy.
Yeah.
And so we did. And Stuart, of course, was being carried in a real baby backpack that we called the hike-a-poose, because that was its trade name. And he's perfectly happy because he has no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
But the other kids, I have this picture in my memoir book, they're all looking very cross, except for Stuart looks happy. So that was probably the second hike that went on in the Sawtooth.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out very well.
Was it still, when you would do that, like when you drove by yourself,
Yeah.
did you still have to go through Bear Valley to get?
Oh, no, you didn't have
Okay.
to then. They had put, when Leslie was just slightly older than when we got to Cabin Lot, they started making the road going through from Malone. It took them quite a while. And I can remember one time we actually drove, this is, Wayne used to be very active with the Boy Scouts, and he had an explorer post, and he had taken the boys up to somewhere around up on Morris Creek Summit. And so I went up there and met him, and the boys' parents came and got them. There was only about 3 or 4 of them anyway. And then we decided to go on to Stanley by the new road. So we drove through it, and it was just mud and potholes all the way. But we did get through to Stanley, but obviously we didn't go back the same way.
Gosh, I wonder when they paved that.
Well, they paved it in pieces.
Okay.
I mean, it took a long time. I mean, we were going up to the cabin a lot, and it was still mostly gravel.
Okay.
For one thing, they didn't pave, the road wasn't paved from Idaho City to Lowman for a long time. I can't remember when it was actually finished.
Yeah.
But of course, they didn't keep it open in all winter, so when the springtime came and they plowed the last bit, you would drive through on Memorial Day and see 20-foot walls of snow that were still not melted. So that went on for quite a while.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry that I don't know the year that it was completed,
Yeah. That's
the paving.
What do you remember about Stanley, the town, when you first started going there? Would you go get like groceries or go to any of the...
Well, we usually try to get our groceries, but see, we stayed in Boise for about 2 years, and then Wayne got a job in Caldwell, because in the 1958 election, the only Republican that got elected statewide was Smiley as a governor. But the rest of the people, it was all the Democrats. And of course, we thought this was lovely because my husband was such a Democrat. But it, of course, was a fluke. Not going to happen ever again.
Yeah.
But Wayne got a job. See, the prosecutor in Canyon County was a Democrat who had been elected. So Wayne had got a job with him. And then the two of them set up a law practice at the same time they were being prosecutor, because there wasn't that much work in those days. You know?
Yeah.
It's not like it is now where they have to have a whole staff in many cases.
Yeah. So you were in town and get your groceries and everything in Caldwell, and then
then go take it up with us.
Yeah.
With our big cooler. There was, do you remember Sessions Lodge when they had that? I mean, that was some groceries there, and we could get a few things like milk. And then Smiley Creek had a few things too. And of course, when we built our cabin, there was still Altair's Lodge was still there.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Well, there was a lodge at Altair's, like at the outlet inn. And it had little cabins, and it had a big lodge with an upstairs where you could stay. And we actually stayed there once when Neil was a baby. And the floor was kind of slanted. But anyway, the Forest Service condemned that whole thing and made it go away. But I went out with one of the cabin neighbors who had a boat, a rowboat. We went out and she showed me where they had drowned the pier that they had there for boats. They didn't take it away, they just cut off the things that held it up and put rocks on it. And if you go to the right place, you can still see the boards underneath the water. They were going to have a new lodge over on the, well, if you're facing up towards if you're at the south end of the lake, or excuse me, I'd be the north end of the lake, and you look toward the inlet, it would have been on the left-hand side of the lake. But they decided not to do that, probably because there are several church camps at Alturas Lake, and I think the church camp people didn't want to have a lodge with all the temptations for their campers.
Would you go to Redfish and to Redfish Lake in that lodge ever?
Oh yeah, of course, but
Yeah.
it was always really expensive to eat there. Although we used to have family dinners, we eventually started having something called Cabin Week, when all our kids were starting to have kids, and everybody would come, and some of them would camp out, because of course we couldn't all fit in the cabin, not when you have families as well as the parents. And So we would sometimes go up to Redfish and have the family dinner celebrating whatever,
Yeah.
or just celebrating cabin week.
I think in my notes, in 1979, you published your hiking book
Yeah.
about the Sawtooth and the White
Okay,
Clouds.
well, what happened is, in the Caldwell Library, I saw a book on the Cascades. I think it was called The 100 Hikes in the Cascades. And that gave me the idea, you know, it would really have been nice if we had a book about how to do these hikes, because the roads were so bad to the trails, and the trails weren't necessarily signed, and the critical junctions weren't signed either. And there were places that people had told me about that they loved that didn't have any trails. So I decided, you know, I could write a book like this. And I wrote up, you know, the hikes that I'd done, and started doing more. And at the College of Idaho, which is in Caldwell, I think I was going over to start taking classes toward getting a teaching credential, and I saw on the door one day a little booklet, a poster for it, hiking trails of the Seven Devils and Owyhee Mountains. And so it said Snake River Regional Studies Center, Donna Parsons, director. So I went to see Donna Parsons, and she wanted me to get my book published. She said, this is something that is under our Snake River Regional Studies Center. And so she wrote, I think we sent out 40 letters to publishers about this book that I was writing. And of course, I only had about 40 hikes in it then. And there was 3 of them that actually wanted to read the manuscript, but nobody wanted to publish it. They thought the Sawtooth in Idaho, that's too far away from anything. Obviously, it was in those days. 2 years later, after I had kept on sort of working on this book from time to time and doing a few more hikes, Louise Marshall called up from Signpost Books, which is one of the people that have read the manuscript, and asked me, did you ever get your book published? And I said, no. Well, we have money now, I think we'd like to publish it. And so that's how I got started with that.
Wow.
And along in the middle of that, the publishing process, Louise started the American Hiking Society, and she was too busy to keep her book company anymore. So she sold it to a man named Cliff Cameron, who worked in her office. And so that's who I worked with. And he was very slow getting anything done. Eventually we got it done, and I mean, he just had a local printer print it, so the printing wasn't the greatest. He published the first 3 editions of the Sawtooth book and the first the edition of the Frank Church book.
Okay.
And then also Trails of Western Idaho. And
Wow.
how I got onto Jerry Painter, who I formed a company with, was that I had written Gloria, I think her last name was Osberg, at Sun Valley, who had worked on a little book about hiking around Sun Valley. And she suggested that I contact Jerry Painter. So anyway, we started this company he and his wife, Julie, and their 4-year-old son, Sam, their youngest child. We went to Sullivan's at Fairfield and they had a meeting about starting this company.
Yeah.
Because he had written some stuff about hiking around Idaho Falls. And I was working on Trails of Eastern Idaho at the time, and I felt I needed some help because I had hurt my knee. It had gotten something the matter with the kneecap, and it was bothering me a lot, and I ended up having a surgery for it. But anyway, So he did some of the hikes for the Eastern book, and I did some of them.
Okay. And was the company was like a...
The company is trailguidebooks.com.
Okay.
You can look that up on
Yeah.
the web if you want to.
Yeah. You must have hiked hundreds of miles for the Sawtooth, and I mean for all of your books, but for the Sawtooth
Well,
book.
we once figured out it's about 6,000 miles.
Wow. What was the feedback like when you published the Sawtooth book? Were people excited or?
Well, it was controversial. There was a guy in Boise who had a mountaineering type store. When he heard about my book, he wanted me to give a slideshow there. And I did that. There were so many people in the basement room that they had to, some of them sit under their feet under the screen. And some other ones sat on the stairs because they couldn't get everybody in there.
Wow.
I went over and I think I brought Stuart, my youngest then, who was always more interested in hiking stuff than the other kids were. And he said, well, you have to write letters to service clubs like Gowanus and Lions and people in different towns around the valley here, and then go and give slideshows at their luncheons. They always have to have a program, and if you can figure out how to have about a 20-minute slideshow for them, they will then buy books, and it's a good way to publicize your books.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that.
Yeah. And people were excited to hear about going hiking in the
Yeah,
Sawtooth.
but the other thing is, other people were not excited. They said, you're giving away all the favorite places of the people that really love this area. You're not supposed to be doing that. Now, you asked about Stanley in the old days,
Mm-hmm.
but there were many fewer things. I mean, they started the library in that little thing that is by the gas station. It once had a Harris collection car in there. And I don't know if it was a Stanley, it was probably a Stanley steamer that was in there.
Wow.
And then the library started in there, and then it was in a little building on the street that goes north and south, a little building to the left. And then, of course, Julie River raised lots of money to build a new library. The Coles were running the hotel, and she had a big little room of books she was selling. And so I would sell her books, and she paid me in cash.
Do you remember when it got designated the Sawtooth National Recreation Area?
Yes, it was in 1972.
Mm-hmm. Did that change things up there that you remember, or was it just...
I don't know. I think the cabins had to have more, they had more restrictions about them. And if you made any changes to your cabin, you had to get approval. But I think you always had to get approval. It just got to be more stringent.
What about when the Sawtooth Wilderness was a designated wilderness?
Well, it was a primitive area before that. You know, it was a Sawtooth primitive area, and then there was the Idaho primitive area that's now the Frankfurt Wilderness. Mm-hmm. And, well, I don't really think that when it was a primitive area that you could take chainsaws in there anyway. I think that you were restricted on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't think it changed it a whole lot.
Yeah.
But I think the publicity, Cecil Anders got to be Secretary of the Interior, and that was so lucky that because he wrote the foreword for my Sawtooth book. At the time he was Secretary of the Interior, my book came out at the time when backpacking was it was the new thing to do. You know, it was very popular because they had freeze-dried foods and backpacks with waistbands that made it much easier to carry this stuff. And those two things made a lot of difference. People were doing it more. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Cliff, my publisher, sold 10,000 books in a couple of years,
Wow.
which is just amazing because they don't sell that well anymore.
Did your kids like going backpacking with you?
Pretty much, they all like to go hiking, but I know that my daughter Hillary is never really liked going backpacking because she had the experience of going into the Bighorn Crags when we went in 1974 where it rained all except one day. And we didn't have we only had one real backpacking tent that I had sewed from a porcelain kit. But the kids just had two tents. And so the water kind of ran in one end and out the other, and Hillary remembers that is not a good thing. So she'll do long hikes, but not go backpacking.
Do you remember, back to the trails in Stanley, were they in bad shape when the trees and brush, or were they mostly kept clear?
You know, I've been in so many times in so many places. Exactly. But mostly I think they are better, but it's all done by volunteers.
Yeah.
It's not, the Forest Service isn't able to do it anymore. They're spending all their money on forest fires.
So back in like the 70s and the 80s, do you remember, were there more trail crews like Forest Service?
Well, I knew a guy named Dave Markham who had the llamas, and he went out sometimes to the Forest Service and cleared trails. But eventually it got so that they didn't want the llamas in the Sawtooth wilderness, and so he actually packed up and left. And
Do you have a favorite hike in the Sawtooths?
people are always asking me that.
It's hard.
But I think there are two of them that are very hard to do for me anymore. I could probably do them, but when you go up to Saddleback Lakes under the elephant's perch, that's really beautiful. And then the other one is Goat Lake, the Goat Lake that's in the Sawtooths. And but I also like Barren Lakes. They're very beautiful.
Do you remember any wildlife encounters or anything around your cabin?
Oh, well, there were always little, I think, golden mantle ground squirrels that lived right by the cabin. And I have a painting I did of one of them, and it's so cute. I don't have it here, obviously, but up in the Frank, when Doug and Stuart and I hiked from Big Creek, down Big Creek, and up the middle of Port to Dagger Falls, we were eating lunch at by the Taylor Ranch, and the badger came out and growled at us. So we had to move our lunch.
You're too close.
We were too close to its den, apparently.
Wow.
And I came face to face once with a mountain goat.
Ooh.
We were hiking through, Stuart and I, from Cold Meadows to the Stoddard Bridge, and along there someplace, the mountain goat just turned up. He's right there. And of course, he's just gone. By the time I say, "Hey, Stuart, there's a mountain goat," Stuart only saw its tail.
Did you go to any of the hot springs around Stanley?
Yeah.
Did you go? Yeah.
There's one near the Fir Creek campground, it's on the way to the Big Hole. Well, if you hike in the Frank, there you go in from the trailhead at the Loon Creek area, and you can walk down about 6 miles, and there are hot springs, and I've been there with Stuart years ago. And Stuart and I went part way to what's called Shower Bath Hot Springs, which is in the upper part of Loon Creek, where you go in from the Sleeping Deer Road.
Okay.
But we never did get to the hot springs because the water was too deep.
Well, thanks, Margaret, for telling me all these stories.
Maybe I'm more of a historical figure now because I was the first person to write a book that was comprehensive about any Idaho trails.
Yeah.